Welcome to some pincushion ideas with GourmetQuilter. I'm Susan Clare, GourmetQuilter, and we're having a whole lot of fun this year with all sorts of programs going on. And this time we're doing 20 pincushions. So we have 20 days of a different pincushion each day. So there's going to be a video and there's a pattern download if you want to get that as well through the website GourmetQuilter.com. If you're getting the pattern, you're going to have something that looks a little bit like this. It's going to have cutting information, and it's going to have words, and it's going to have shapes and things. In this case we need shapes, so they're there for you to trace and use as a pattern. So this is pincushion number 19 of our 20, so we're on the second to last pincushion. We have been having so much fun. So we're just dreaming of sailing away this time. We're having a little sailboat pincushion. So this is kind of cute. It's just heading somewhere nice. I'm not sure where it's going. So this is the pincushion part down on the lower part here. We've got a mast and a sail and a flag. What more could you want? So we're going to have a little bit of things to think about with this one, getting the mast and everything like that. But it's not too hard. So in the pattern, as I said, there were shapes for the boat and things. So to get started, we need to do some pre-quilting. So I'm putting batting behind everything, and we've got some fusible web that we need. We need a little bit of florist wire to put in. That's in the mast to keep it up nice and straight. So if you're going to use wire, you probably should consider having something that will cut. Most pliers have a wire cutter, but don't use your good scissors on wire. So I've gone ahead and done some quilting. So for the actual boat, I'm having a red boat this time. For the actual boat, top and bottom, I'm using this red here, and I've quilted that in just straight lines. Probably you can see it better from the back. Approximately 1/4 inch or so apart. And then rather than have lots of separate small pieces, I put both pieces that needed quilting on the one piece of batting. And I've quilted my side, and again, everything's a little bit oversized. So this is my side of my boat where I've got the darker blue, it's going to be red. And then we're going to, so I need to cut from here the bottom of the boat. So the bottom is going to be this red, so this is the bottom shape. And then the top of the boat is actually divided. We need to have a seam down the middle so that we can put the mast and the sail point in and things like that. So we need to cut a pair of these. So remember to turn it over for the second one. Don't cut them both the same because that won't work so well. And then this is going to be, as I said, a side strip, which is kind of like a gusset going around there. That also will need trimming down. So I've quilted that with just going the short way, some lines, not as many as on here. And then on our little stripe on our boat here, we're just going to fuse on and then stitch on just a narrow strip. So I've just put some fusible web on the back of the strip. We're going to have a nice yellowy coloured stripe. So I just need to cut a narrow strip of that and cut this down to the right size and cut my boat out. So I think I'll go ahead and do all that and show it to you all cut and ready to put the stripe on so that you can see how we do all those things. So I've gone ahead, I've cut out my boat, I've cut out the two top bits for the boat, I've cut out my side piece, and I've got my little narrow strip ready. So that's ready to fuse on now. So I'm just going to do that. So it just wants to go down the center, and we're just going to stitch that on. Just a straight stitch is fine. This will be slightly long because I've trimmed the other bit, and I think if we can just get it in the middle, that will be quite good. So I'm just going to iron that on. And then I can just machine stitch that down. So it is a raw edge, but because it's fused, it's fine, and I'm just using a regular straight stitch. So I'll go ahead and I'll get this stitched on. So I'm just stitching either side on the yellow, just close to the edge though. So I've gone ahead and I've stitched my little yellow stripe on. If you didn't want that raw edge with the straight stitch, you could do a little blanket stitch or any number of different things. I've now also just joined it up into a circle, so just the two short ends together with our regular 1/4 inch seam. So that is now ready for us to sort out. That's the side of our boat that's going to go around as a little gusset. But in the meantime, before we do any of that, I think we need to get some of the other bits ready. So we've got to get the sail ready. So on the pattern there's a sail, there's a flag, and there's a mast, and there's a little bit here that I've just kind of called a secure anchor point for the sail to go to. So we can make all that just with the fabric fused together. So I haven't turned it or anything. I've done that straight stitch with the raw edge, but it's fused together, and I've done that for the flag, the mast and the sail. However, the mast has got wire in it as well, so we have to treat the mast a little bit differently. So all I've done for the sail is I've got some fusible web already on the back of half of my fabric, and onto the right side of the fabric I just want to trace the outline of the sail, and that's going to be my stitching line. So you don't want a great hefty line, but just enough that you can see it to stitch it, so that when we fuse it together we can do the stitching and then cut it out afterwards. And that works really well for this sort of work, because nothing's really going to happen to it. And the same thing with the flag, we can do that, and I think I'd probably put fusible web behind the hole of this little square, but that's okay, it'll just be a little bit stiffer on the flag. And this, we can do the same with the mast. So I did purposely put the fusible web on the full piece of for the mast, because we want double-sided, we want to be able to fuse it together with wire between. But we still need a shape, and it's a little bit harder because I've got a dark fabric here. But I can probably see that enough to draw myself a line, so I'll go ahead and do that. But in the meantime, I can just show you with these bits here. So I'm just on the sail, I'm just going to peel off the paper, so we've got fusible on half of it, and we'll just come over to the iron and we'll just fold that over and fuse it, so we've basically got a fusible web sandwich with fabric either side, and we've got a drawn sail on one side. So what I'm suggesting that we do is just come around and stitch that. So you may want to just make your stitch length, you don't need to, but I like to make it perhaps just a touch smaller when I'm doing this sort of thing. And I'm just going to stitch right on that line that I've drawn, and just a regular straight stitch is fine for this, unless you want to do something different, of course. Finish that off, and then all I'm going to do for my sail is just cut close to that stitched line, so quite close. I am using a batik cloth, so it doesn't fray as much as some other cloths might do, but this works with regular cottons as well. I've done this sort of work with all sorts of fabric. So just cutting quite close to the stitching, and that the stitching gives us a nice little sort of edging, holds it all together nicely, and so there's our sail already, so you can see that that's going to go quite nicely on our boat. So the flag is made in exactly the same way. I just need to fold that and stitch and then cut out my flag. The mast is similar, so I'll come back and show you how to do the mast. Oh, the little anchor point for the sail, this little front bit here, that is done the same way as the sail as well, so I'll come back and show you how to do the mast. Okay, so I've done my sail, well you saw me do the sail, I've done my flag, I've done that little anchor point, and now I'm just going to do the mast. So I've drawn my mast, it's a bit hard to see, but I've got it drawn on the right side of the fabric, but I also need to know where that drawing is on the fusible on this particular one, because it will help us a lot with positioning this wire. It's a little bit tricky because we have to take the fusible off. Even though I've drawn on it, it will help us line up because we can kind of hover it over to make sure that we're in the right place. So we don't have to take it all off, you can do. Now I've got two bits of florist wire here. I'm not sure what gauge they are. They're reasonably stiff but not super stiff. And I'm just going to lay those. Now we don't want it sticking out the top because we're going to sew around on that line. So we want to start just down a little bit so that we can sew nearby. And I found it was best to have two wires and to have them separated just a little tiny bit in the middle. So I just need to know where my top is, where I want them to go, and then to set those two fairly close together but not absolutely together, so they just give it that little bit of extra strength when they're just apart like that. And just double check. You can do it with the paper, you can kind of see where the wire's going, and that's all looking pretty good for stitching around it. So I can probably take the paper off now. I've got the drawing on the underside of where the wires are, and I'm just going to fold that over. So I've got fusible web all over this now, and then I can iron it all together with the wire, and just mind you not bending it as you go, of course, always a good thought. But if we just fuse that, and I've got some wire cutters so I can trim the end with my wire cutters afterwards. So that's all looking pretty good. But what I want to do now is do my little stitching like we did on the sail. So I'll go ahead and do that. You can see it's, you just have to be a little bit more careful when there's little bits of wire and things around, but it's all absolutely possible. So I'll just do it so that you can see that. So I'm just stitching on that drawn line, and then when I get to the top here I have to just do the round bit, but because I didn't put the wire right to the very top, I can stitch around quite happily knowing that everything's quite okay there. And then I'm ready to come back down again. And now I'm ready to trim that just the same as we did with the other bits. Trim it up close. And then we'll start putting that boat together. We'll just set these aside for the moment in a minute. And I've got these little wire cutters, so I'm just going to trim that wire off just there. So it's not hard to do when you've got some cutters. And so we've got our mast. We're looking pretty good. We've got a sail, got a flag, excellent. So what we now want to do is start working on the actual boat. We want to start putting the side or the gusset into the boat. So pretty much like when we do circles, we want to mark some points on our sides. So just on one edge to start with, we need to do something like our quarter points. Works pretty well. Even though it's not a circle, we can come up with something that works pretty well for us, I think. And this one just moved a little when I wasn't watching. And then we need to do a similar thing here. We're going to put the bottom of the boat in first. So we just want to mark those strategic points. Now we can't really get an exact halfway, but we can kind of do something that's sort of close-ish, and it probably, we can adjust it as we're pinning it if we need to, because sometimes we've got these sort of corners to get around and things. We've got to do a little bit of easing with this. So I'm putting the seam at the back, so we want this to be inside out. We want this seam to go, well, it doesn't have to, it could go anywhere, but I'm going to put mine at the back. And I'm going to pin the back and the front first. I always feel like a spider when I'm doing this. I'm not a fan of spiders, so they feel a bit like pins anyway. And then we're going to ease this around, so that the main easing is going to be around this corner here. It should all just fit quite nicely. So just pop some pins in, and then we may need to come back and re-pin if need be. A couple more pins is better than not enough when you're doing this sort of easing. Make sure this is, it's all looking pretty good to me. So I just want a couple of pins in that longish stretch there. And then around that corner, just make sure there's enough fabric, but not too much, because we've got to stitch it. Remember, we're stitching 1/4 of an inch in. Oh, it is looking pretty good, I think. So I've just got to do that little back corner again. It's a little bit full on this side for some reason just there. It's only a little bit. We need it to be a little bit full so that it will stand up nicely for us on those sides and fill those corners out nicely. So that's all looking pretty good. So really I just need to stitch that now. And I think it's probably going to be better to stitch it from this side with the side on top, because if you've got these little crinkles that could potentially happen if they're underneath, you can watch them and make sure that they're not going to crinkle and bubble. So just add normal 1/4 inch seam and just keep an eye on everything sitting nicely. If you go slowly, you can leave the pins in. I think we're looking pretty good. So I'll continue on. I think you've got the hang of this now. I'll go around and I will show you the next bit. So I've gone ahead and I did leave a gap. The pattern tells you to leave a gap in the seam. You want to leave the gap, well, there's markings in the pattern, but sort of towards, on that wider part, opposite roughly where the mast is going to go, because we're going to want to get in for that mast. So I've gone ahead and done all that. It's all looking pretty good. And I can turn it, but I'm not ready to turn it yet. But I am just going to trim that seam just a little bit, because it's all going around corners. So not a lot, but I'll just trim all the way round so that it's just a little bit easier for it to sit more comfortably. So I can do that shortly. I just want to show you now how to get the top ready. So on the pattern there's a couple of marks, and that's where the little anchor point part goes for the sail, and also there's another mark where the mast goes. So we want to leave, so we're going to stitch this centre seam to make our top, but we need to leave a gap where the mast goes, because the mast is going to go right down so that it stands up within the filling. We need to be able to poke it in afterwards. It doesn't bend, so we can't put it in and turn it out the right way. So I've left my little anchor point a little bit longer than I needed to. I'm going to stitch that in that seam where the marking said to put it, but I'm going to leave a gap. The gap does need to be big enough for the mast, not a whole lot bigger, just big enough for the mast. So it's really just sewing that centre seam, leaving a gap in it, otherwise sewing the whole seam. So I'll go ahead and I'll do that so that I can make sure the mast is all going to fit. So that's looking good. I've got my little bit sticking up there so that I can stitch my sail to it. And I'm just going to make sure that my mast fits through that hole, and it fits through just nicely. So that's really good. So now we're ready really to just go ahead and do exactly the same thing as we've done with the bottom, with the top. We just need to pin it in and stitch it around, and we've got a gap here so that we can turn all that out the right way. So I'll go ahead and get all that done, because it's really just the same as we did on the bottom. So I've gone ahead and I've sewn my top in. Now I've trimmed the seam. On the bottom seam I didn't mention, but don't trim the seam where the gap is. But all the rest of it I said I was trimming that, and I've trimmed the top seam. So I'm ready to turn that out the right way now. And we should have a nice red boat with a yellow stripe. It's looking pretty good already, with a hole for the mast. It's always good to just run a finger or a tool around the seams, make sure things are sitting out as nicely as they can. This is not an easy one to press because it's all shaped, but I think it's all going to be pretty good. So I've got my little bit sticking up there to attach the sail to. Oh, I think it's all looking pretty good. So what we need to do now, this is going to be the fiddliest bit, is putting the mast in. So I've left this hole here for the mast to go in. I've marked, on the pattern there was a mark, so I've marked where the mast should come to. And because we've got our gap there, we just want to try not to bend our mast, but we do need to stitch this gap closed, and we need to have the mast stitched into it. It's quite hard to stitch by hand, but it would definitely be an option. But I'm actually going to pull that out a little bit again and see if I can do it by machine, trying not to bend the mast as I go. So I can do that. I've got that so it's sitting pretty straight, I think. So my seam in the centre is this bit here where there's the little gap. So I just want to stitch that gap closed with the mast. Now the wire's in there, and that's okay if you just take it slowly. It's no thicker than a pin, so you can stitch straight across that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. It is a little bit fiddly, I have to admit, but nothing I've discovered is impossible. I was really fortunate growing up. My mother taught me to sew, and she let me use a sewing machine from quite a young age, and I used to sew all kinds of things. It was probably one of the best things that my mother could have ever done for me, because I learned that, because children will try anything, and I learned that you can pretty much sew anything on a sewing machine. Leaves, plastic, wire, sorts of things, without damaging the machine even. So there you see I have managed to do that. It was tight and a touch awkward, but not impossible. So that is looking pretty good. I now have my gap closed so that the filling won't escape. And so we're ready to fill a little boat now, because the other bits we can put on afterwards. You could put the flag on now if you wanted to, whilst there's a little bit less going on. The flag is just the same sort of thing. I've just stitched it to the back of the mast at the top here, so just with a straight stitch. You can see it here. So I might even do that, because once the filling's in, it does get harder to manage to do all these sorts of things. So I'm just going to stitch that on there as well. We could probably even do the sail at the moment too. So the same thing, we want to stitch the front point there, we want to stitch the back point onto that side, and then there's a little bit of looping going on so that the sail just billows a little bit at the top there. So all of this is easier to do before we fill it. So I think I'll go ahead and do all these little bits so that it's done. You could do this by hand, but again, with all that fusing in there, it is a little bit harder to do some of this stitching by hand. Stitch the front of the sail to this little bit here. Now we just have to make sure the wind doesn't get up and it doesn't sail away before we're ready, because we have to fill it now. So I'm going to get the filling and start filling it in through here. So I've got my filling, I've got the crushed walnut shell, which I'm going to fill my boat with. So nothing too hard about this part. We've kind of done all the hard part. Isn't that fun? It's just a matter of making sure that this goes where we want it to go. It'll take a little bit of filling. We don't want to overfill this, because we don't want that. It's raised up just a little bit there, which is fine, but you don't want it sort of popping right up. Well, you might want a boat that pops right up. I shouldn't say you don't want it that way. However, we're just going to fill it so that reasonably full, but not over full. And so we've got that mast in there that we need to wiggle around as well and fill around, so that it's the filling will help support the mast once we've got enough in there. You can sort of see that that's going to help hold it up nicely as well. So because it goes down the height of the boat, so that was why we had an extra bit in there to do that. So I'll go ahead and keep filling this and then we just got to stitch the gap closed, so I'll come back and show you when I've got it just about done. So I'm just finishing off the last couple of stitches of this gap here, and then I can just show you how it all looks together. My little knotty thing at the end. And come out. So you just have to be careful not to bend your mast when you're filling it and doing the sewing and things like that. It sits much better if it's not bent. But you can see that you can wiggle it around in there so that it'll sit up nice and straight for you. I think that's probably looking pretty good, and you can just squidge it around so it's more comfortable. And now we've got two little sailboats out for a sail. How much fun is that? So that was a pincushion number 19, only one more to go. So I hope you've enjoyed that sail away one, and I look forward to seeing you again with pincushion number 20.